Hello and welcome to part 17 of our video series on building a Node, Express and Postgres-based API. Today we're going to make a start on our authentication tokens, and what those are going to be is essentially when a user authenticates against the application, we want to generate an authentication token so that we can pass that back to the user, which allows them to then sign any incoming API requests to authorize them to have access to do things like updating their own user, deleting their own user, that type of thing. So it'll make sure that we can have some level of authentication and then authorization for the different API endpoints that we're going to create in the future for update and delete. If you want to follow along, there is a link in the video description for the GitHub repo that we're going to be working from, and the branch that we're going to be working from today is part 17 start. So first things first, we're going to add a new migration into our migrations folder, and the way that we're going to do that is by using npm run migrate create and then authentication tokens table, and that should generate us an authentication tokens tables migration file that we can use here. And what we're going to do is we can take a little bit of boilerplate from our user table creation here and just pop that in, just so that we're not having to write everything out. And then what we're going to do is we'll just have pgm.create table, and it's going to be authentication tokens. And what this is going to do, so each authentication token is going to have an ID, which is fine, and the authentication tokens are also going to have they're going to have a token, which is going to have we'll give that a varchar 255 not null of true, and then we'll get rid of pretty much everything. We'll keep created at, and then what we're going to do is we're going to add user ID. That's going to be a type integer not null true unique true. So what this is going to be is essentially the relation between the token and the user. So that's going to give us the relationship between the users table and then the authentication tokens table as well. And then we'll leave the created at so that we know when the token was created, so that we can expire those tokens in the future as well. And then what we're going to do is we'll add a constraint, because we want to add a foreign key constraint, so that only records that can get inserted into this table with a user ID can be inserted if that user ID also exists within our user table. So it makes sure that any authentication tokens that get inserted into here are only ever going to be inserted for users that exist within the user table. So that'll add a nice bit of parity between our users table and our authentication tokens table. So we'll add a new constraint. We'll add it for the authentication tokens table, and then what we're going to call it is foreign key user ID authentication token. So it's just going to connect a user ID with an authentication token as a foreign key. And what we're going to do is we'll change this from I'll drop that down onto a new line, and then we'll change this to foreign keys, and then what we'll do is we'll add columns user ID. So that's a column within this table, so within the authentication table, and then we'll add a references, and then we're going to put in users ID. And what this will do is give us the reference to the external table that we want to add the foreign key constraint for. So it will just mean that this user ID will need to exist within this users table as an ID for it to be able to be inserted into this table. So that's looking good there. We'll need to update our drop constraint here so that we drop the right constraint when we are deleting the table. Because what you can't do if you've got a foreign key constraint, you can't drop any tables that are referenced by that foreign key constraint. So I couldn't drop the users table before dropping this constraint here. So it just makes sure that there's never any drifting of data that would mean that the authentication tokens table could exist or could have a record for a user ID that doesn't exist within the users table. And then we'll update our drop table here as well, and we'll just drop the authentication tokens table. So that's our new migration there, and what we can do is we can run that migration now by running npm run migrate up, and you should see that we have a nice output here, which is basically the commands that have been run against the against Postgres to modify or create our tables. If for some reason you run into any errors when running this migrate create, what I would suggest doing is having a look at the SQL output here and just making sure that it kind of matches up with the commands that we're expecting. A common one to get slightly wrong is this adding a constraint. So just want to make sure that first foreign keys is spelled correctly, because if it's not, then it won't get picked up as a new constraint. And then the columns needs to be just user ID, and then the references is users, and then in brackets or in braces ID, so that it's got the users table there, and then ID, as you'll see that it actually uses it in the query there. So just a couple of small things to look out for if you start to see errors in there. If you do see any errors that you can't figure out, drop a comment on the video and I'll help you out as much as I can. So now that we've got that done, that will create our authentication tokens table, so that we'll have somewhere to put a token for a user in the future, which is great. But what we're going to do while we're here as well, we're going to need to make a couple of changes to our test utils, because what's going to happen is we've currently got a database query between our integration tests that we've written that will look to truncate our table between tests. And what's going to happen is you can't truncate a table that has a foreign key constraint that's in use. So what we're going to do is we're just going to write a couple of queries here that is going to satisfy removing and re-adding that foreign key constraint, so that we can actually go ahead and truncate the tables that we want to as well. So what we're going to do is, first of all, we're just going to add a new query into here, which is going to truncate the table authentication tokens. So we'll truncate that, and then we'll add a slightly more complex query just above this, which is going to be alter table authentication tokens drop constraint, and then we're going to have drop constraint, and then we'll just grab the name of the constraint that we made in our migration here. Just grab that, copy, paste that, drop constraint, and then that should do it for that piece. And then what we'll do, so what's going to happen here is when we run this reset databases within our integration tests, we'll go through, we'll drop the foreign key constraint, which will allow us to then truncate our authentication tokens and our users without any issues. And then once those have been truncated, what we're going to then do is we're going to run another alter table command, but we're going to actually add a new constraint. Add constraint. It's going to be that constraint name. And then what that constraint is going to be is a foreign key constraint. So it's just going to be foreign key, then it'll be user ID, references users ID. So what that will mean is, after we've truncated the table, we'll just go ahead and add this back in, so that we've got the constraint back in where we need it to be. And what we'll do, just to sanity check and make sure that's all running okay, is we'll just start up our service, npm run integration tests, and we'll just check and make sure that those tests are passing okay, running up a couple of times just to make sure that the foreign key constraints and everything have been dropped, and that'll make sure that our test utilities are still working, because if we don't do that, then what's going to happen is when you start to run your integration tests after making this change, it's going to start to fail. So we'll make sure that that's working as intended. So that's it for the authentication tokens table. What we'll do next time is we will start to add in our authentication tokens store and some methods to help create, update or delete tokens as well. So that's it for today. I hope the video was informative, and I will catch you next time.